December 25th, 1945. The mess hall at Camp McCoy smelled of bacon and butter scents so rich they seemed almost offensive in their abundance. Keiko Tanaka stood at the threshold, her hands trembling as she stared at the plate before her. Behind her, 200 Japanese women prisoners stood in a silence so profound it felt like prayer. But this was not gratitude. This was shock bordering on rage. When the first woman began to cry, the sound was not soft or grateful. It was the kind of crying that comes from a place beyond tears, beyond words, beyond anything that could be explained to the young American soldiers who stood watching with confused expressions on their well-fed faces. To the guards, this was just breakfast. To the women standing in that mess hall, it was proof that everything they had been taught, everything they had believed, everything they had sacrificed for was a lie. But to understand how they came to this moment staring at bacon and freedom in equal measure, we must return to the beginning, to the ashes of Nagasaki and the voyage that would shatter every certainty these women had ever known. 4 months earlier, Keiko had been a different person living in a different world. Or perhaps it was the same world and she simply hadn't known what it looked like without the lens of propaganda distorting every truth into comfortable fiction. August 9th, 1945. The morning had started with unusual heat, the kind that made the air shimmer above the hospital courtyard, where Keiko was preparing supplies for the day's surgeries. She was 24 years old, a graduate of Nagasaki Medical College, and she had learned to ration hope the same way she rationed bandages. One patient at a time, one wound at a time, one small mercy in a war that had stopped showing mercy years ago. The flash came at 11:02 in the morning. Not the sunset orange of incendiary bombs or the gray-black of conventional explosives, but something else entirely. Something white and absolute, like the sun had fallen into the city and decided to stay. Keiko was inside the supply room when the ceiling came down. She remembered the sound more than the impact. A crack like the world splitting open, followed by screaming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When she dug herself out of the rubble, her hands were bleeding and her ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine that wouldn't stop. The hospital was gone. Not damaged or destroyed in the conventional sense, but simply gone as if a giant hand had reached down and erased it from existence. The patients she had been treating that morning, the nurses she had trained with, the doctors who had taught her to see past suffering, to the small victories of saved lives, all of them were buried under tons of concrete and twisted metal. She spent 3 days pulling survivors from the rubble. 3 days without sleep, without food, without anything except the desperate need to find someone, anyone who was still breathing. She found 17 people alive. She watched 43 die in her arms. On the 4th day, when the rescue teams finally arrived with American occupation forces trailing behind them, Keiko was arrested. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she wore a nurse's uniform and had worked in a military hospital. In the new world order emerging from the ashes of surrender that made her a prisoner of war. She was given 10 minutes to gather her belongings. She took a change of clothes, a pair of gloves worn thin from years of rationing, and a small notebook with a blood-stained cover. Inside the notebook was a letter from her younger sister, Ayumi, delivered the morning before the bomb. Keiko had been too busy to read it. Now she couldn't bring herself to open it, because opening it meant confronting the possibility that Ayumi was dead, and her mother was dead, and the letter was the last piece of them she would ever hold. The transport ship left Guam on August 20th with just under 300 women aboard. Most were nurses or radio operators or clerical workers who had served in auxiliary units scattered across the Pacific. They had been promised they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, but none of them knew what that meant. The Geneva Convention was something that happened to other people in other wars. Japan had never signed it. Japan's enemies were supposed to be devils who knew nothing of mercy. The first crack in that certainty came on the 2nd day at sea. Keiko stood on deck watching an American guard drink from his canteen. He took 3 long swallows, then casually poured out the remaining half and refilled it from a barrel marked potable water. The water splashed onto the deck and ran into the scuppers, wasted as if it were nothing. In Nagasaki, water had been rationed to 1 cup per patient per day. Keiko had watched men die of thirst in beds surrounded by nurses who had nothing to give them except apologies. She had held a cup to a soldier's lips and watched him try to make 3 swallows last an hour because he knew that cup was all he would get until tomorrow. And here was this American boy, this enemy, who was supposed to be weak and desperate and on the verge of starvation, pouring out fresh water like it was garbage. Beside her, a young woman named Michiko Sato watched the same scene with narrowed eyes. Michiko was 20 years old, small and wiry, with the kind of sharp tongue that had gotten her into trouble more than once during the war. She had been a radio operator in Okinawa, and she had survived the battle that killed her younger brother. "They want us to see this," Michiko whispered, her voice tight with anger. "It's theater. Propaganda to make us think they're strong when they're really on the verge of collapse." But even as she said it, her hands were shaking. The voyage took 10 days. During those 10 days, the women experienced the first systematic dismantling of everything they had been taught about their enemy. Meals were served 3 times a day in a mess hall that smelled of things they had almost forgotten. Real coffee, not the burnt acorn substitute they had been drinking since 1943. White bread made from actual wheat, soft and yielding nothing like the sawdust rations that had passed for bread in the final years. Canned peaches that tasted impossibly sweet. Butter, sugar, portions of meat that seemed obscene in their size. Some women ate timidly, taking small bites and waiting for the nausea that would signal poison. Others wept silently as they chewed, remembering children who had starved, while their mothers fed them lies about how the Americans were suffering worse, how Japan's sacrifices would lead to victory, how perseverance would overcome the enemy's hollow abundance. The third woman at Keiko's table was Hana Nishida, 19 years old, a medical student from Kyoto who had been conscripted in the final months of the war. Hana was brilliant in the way that terrified her instructors, always asking questions that had no comfortable answers, always pushing past the boundaries of what she was supposed to accept on faith. She had brought a small notebook with her, and she was documenting everything. The dimensions of the mess hall, the number of crates being unloaded at each port of call, the height and weight of the American sailors, the portions of food, the waste. On the 5th day, Keiko asked her what she was doing. "Gathering evidence," Hana said quietly, not looking up from her careful measurements. "My father taught me that numbers don't lie. He's a general. He told me that Japanese spirit would overcome American materialism, that our dedication would defeat their decadence. But if that's true, why do their decadent sailors look stronger than our dedicated soldiers? Why does their materialist abundance exceed anything we ever had, even before the war?" She finally looked up, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been rage. "I need to know if my father lied to me, or if he was lied to as well." The question hung in the air between them, too dangerous to answer, too important to ignore. On the 6th day, a storm hit. Not a typhoon, just a normal Pacific storm, the kind that came through every few weeks during the season. The kind that Japanese fishing boats had learned to navigate for centuries. The American ship cut through it like it was nothing. Keiko stood at a porthole, watching sailors work on deck in the driving rain. They moved with casual efficiency, their bodies strong and coordinated, securing cargo and adjusting rigging with the kind of teamwork that came from endless practice and adequate nutrition. One sailor, who couldn't have been more than 20, lifted a crate that would have required 5 Japanese soldiers to move. He shifted it into position, secured it with rope, and moved on to the next task without breaking stride. These were common sailors, not elite troops or specially selected specimens for propaganda purposes. Just ordinary American boys doing ordinary work. And they were stronger, healthier, better fed, and more capable than the best soldiers Japan had managed to field in the final years of the war. Michiko, watching the same scene from a nearby porthole, turned away and vomited into a bucket. Not from seasickness. The ship was barely pitching. She vomited from the cognitive dissonance of watching everything she believed crumble into salt spray and rain. "It's staged," she whispered when she could speak again. "It has to be staged. They're specially selected, giants chosen to make us feel small." But her voice carried no conviction. Even she didn't believe it anymore. Hana was writing in her notebook, her hands shaking so badly the numbers were almost illegible. She was calculating muscle mass, bone density, coordination metrics, trying to find a scientific explanation for what they were seeing that didn't require accepting the unacceptable. "The average American sailor on this ship," she said quietly, "has approximately 30% more muscle mass than the average Japanese officer I treated in field hospitals. Their bone density is superior. Their teeth are strong and intact. Their eyesight is better. Their reaction time is faster. This is not theater. This is baseline. This is normal for them. She closed the notebook and looked at Keiko with eyes that had aged a decade in 6 days. If this is what they consider ordinary, what did we ever think we were fighting? September 1st, 1945. The ship docked in San Francisco Bay just after dawn, and the women got their first look at an American city. The fog was lifting in patches, revealing glimpses of a world that should not have been possible. The Golden Gate Bridge emerged from the mist like something out of a dream, its towers soaring higher than any structure most of the women had ever seen, its cables spanning a distance that seemed to defy physics and common sense. No nation at war, no nation on the verge of collapse, no nation suffering the way Japan had been told America was suffering, could possibly have the resources to build something like that. But there it stood, solid, real, impossible to deny. Beyond the bridge, the city rose in layers of steel and glass. Skyscrapers that made Tokyo's tallest buildings look like children's toys. Streets filled with automobiles, not the rare luxuries they had become in Japan, but ordinary vehicles driven by ordinary people, going about ordinary business. Electric lights blazing even in daylight, a waste of power that would have been unthinkable in Japan since 1942. The harbor itself was a revelation. Ships of every size and description, cargo vessels and fishing boats and pleasure craft, moving in coordinated chaos that spoke of a maritime infrastructure Japan had lost years ago. Dock workers unloaded crates with mechanical lifts and forklifts, technology that Japanese ports had never possessed even in peacetime. And the people. Even from the ship, the women could see them. Dock workers who moved with the casual strength of men who had never known real hunger. Children running along the waterfront, their bodies sturdy and their laughter carrying across the water. Women in colorful dresses that spoke of textile abundance Japan hadn't seen since before the war. Michiko stood at the rail, gripping it so hard her knuckles went white. Tears streamed down her face, but she wasn't making a sound. Just standing there, watching a world that wasn't supposed to exist, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been taught. "This cannot be real," she said finally. "We are in a propaganda film. They built a stage. This is theater." But even as she said it, a young boy ran past on the dock below, chasing a baseball that had gotten away from him. He was maybe 12 years old, and he was taller than some of the Japanese officers Keiko had known. His arms were thick with the kind of muscle that came from good food and regular exercise. His teeth visible when he laughed at something his friends said were straight and white and intact. That boy, that ordinary American child playing a game on a Tuesday morning, was healthier and stronger than soldiers Japan had sent to die in the Pacific. Hana was writing again, her hand moving faster now, almost frantic. She was documenting everything she could see, every building, every vehicle, every person, trying to create a record that couldn't be denied or explained away later. "If this is what defeat looks like," she whispered, "what was victory ever supposed to be?" The train that carried them east was another lesson in abundance. It moved smoothly on rails that had been maintained instead of stripped for scrap metal. The cars were clean and well lit, with seats that didn't collapse under weight and windows that actually closed against the weather. The locomotive itself was a marvel of engineering that put Japan's struggling rail system to shame. But it was the landscape that delivered the final crushing blow to any remaining faith in the propaganda they had been raised on. They crossed California and saw fields of vegetables stretching to the horizon, irrigated by systems that brought water where it was needed instead of rationing it like gold. They crossed Nevada and saw cattle ranches with herds numbering in the thousands, while Japan had been forced to slaughter its livestock years ago to feed a starving population. They crossed the heartland and saw small towns that looked prosperous and intact, with churches and schools and main streets lined with shops that appeared to be open and doing business. At every station stop, the contrast became more unbearable. Children playing, families laughing, people who looked well-fed and unconcerned, as if war were something that happened in distant places to other people. In Nebraska, the train stopped for 10 minutes in a small town whose name Keiko never learned. There were children on the platform selling lemonade and homemade cookies to passengers. Not because they were starving and desperate, but because it was summer and they were bored and this was something to do. Hana stared at those children through the window, her scientific mind trying to process what her eyes were telling her. The youngest couldn't have been more than 10, a boy with freckles and a gap-toothed smile. He was taller than many of the soldiers she had treated in the final months. His skin was clear and healthy. His arms had the kind of strength that came from abundance, not deprivation. She pulled out her notebook and wrote a single line that would haunt her for years. If this is America's dying race, then what is a thriving one? At the next station, an American soldier finished eating a sandwich and threw the remaining half into a trash bin. It was a casual gesture, the kind of thing people do without thinking when they've never known hunger. Machiko saw it happen. She watched the bread arc through the air and land in the garbage. White bread with meat and cheese, more food than her younger brother Takeshi had eaten in the last week of his life. She was off the train before anyone could stop her. She ran to the trash bin, reached in and pulled out the sandwich. It was still wrapped in wax paper, barely touched the kind of meal that would have been a feast for her family. Keiko followed her, caught her by the arm, saw the sandwich clutched in her shaking hands. "Have we become dogs?" Keiko asked quietly. "Picking through their garbage?" Machiko looked at her, and the expression on her face was beyond shame, beyond anger, beyond anything that had a name. "Dogs or fools," she said. "Which were we in the war?" It was the first time either of them had spoken the thought aloud. The question that had been building since the first morning on the ship, growing larger with every meal, every wasted scrap, every casual display of abundance that should not have existed. The other women on the platform heard the exchange. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the truth being spoken in daylight. Others nodded slowly, their own certainties crumbling like the sandwich wrapper in Machiko's hands. When they reboarded the train, the women were no longer prisoners of war, united in defiance of their captors. They were believers and doubters, divided by the question that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The train carried them through Wisconsin as September turned the landscape gold and red. They passed farms with barns bigger than any building in their home villages. They passed silos filled with grain standing tall against the sky like monuments to abundance. They passed fields where combines harvested wheat in quantities that would have fed a Japanese prefecture for months. And finally, on September 5th, they arrived at Camp McCoy. The camp itself was almost disappointing in its ordinariness. Rows of wooden barracks, clean and well-maintained, but not elaborate. A mess hall that smelled of cooking food. Guard towers with lights that gave the whole compound a yellowish glow in the fading afternoon sun. Barbed wire fences that looked functional rather than cruel. An American matron met them at the gate. She was middle-aged and stern-faced, with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she had been a school teacher or a hospital administrator before the war. She spoke through an interpreter, her words clipped and efficient. "Welcome to Camp McCoy. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. That means humane conditions, adequate food and medical care, and respect for your dignity as prisoners of war. Follow the rules, cause no trouble, and you will find your time here tolerable. Cause problems, and you will face appropriate consequences. Do you understand?" The women nodded, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting for the cruelty that propaganda had promised would come. Waiting for the Americans to reveal their true nature as devils, who showed kindness only as a prelude to greater torment. But the cruelty didn't come. They were assigned to barracks, given clean bedding, and shown to a washroom that had running water. Hot and cold, the matron explained through the interpreter. Available from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. Hot water on demand for prisoners. The concept was so foreign that most of the women simply stared at the showerheads, trying to understand what they were being told. The matron, perhaps sensing their confusion, turned one of the shower handles. Water cascaded out, steam rising in the cool September air. She held her hand under the stream, adjusted the temperature, and stepped back. "Until you're clean," she said, answering a question that hadn't been asked. "Use as much as you need." She left them there, staring at running water like it was a miracle instead of basic plumbing. Keiko was the first to step forward. She had spent the last month bathing with cold water from a bucket when she could get it going, days without washing when she couldn't. The hospital in Nagasaki had lost its hot water system in 1940, forcing them to boil water over fires for surgeries and let everything else go cold. She stepped into the stall, still wearing her clothes, and turned the handle the way the matron had shown her. Hot water hit her like a blessing and a curse, washing away weeks of grime while opening wounds she hadn't known existed. The flashback hit her without warning. Nagasaki, 1943, standing in the hospital courtyard trying to boil enough water to sterilize surgical instruments for an amputation, feeding precious wood into a fire that wouldn't stay hot enough, watching the clock tick toward the moment when they would have to operate anyway, with instruments that weren't quite clean enough because the patient was dying and they had no choice. And here in an enemy prison camp, there was unlimited hot water, pressure strong enough to massage sore muscles, temperature perfect enough to ease aches she had been carrying for years, available every day for hours at a time for prisoners who were supposed to be receiving the bare minimum necessary for survival. Her legs gave out. She slid down the tile wall and sat there, under the spray, sobbing with a rage that had no outlet and no target except the universe itself for being this cruel, this unjust, this incomprehensibly wrong. While her patients died from infections that could have been prevented with hot water and soap, while she boiled needles until they lost their edge, while children screamed from wounds that festered because there was no way to keep anything truly clean, the Americans had this. And they had always had it. It wasn't a recent development or a wartime innovation. It was baseline, normal, the minimum standard for treating enemy prisoners. Other women entered the showers and other women broke down. Some stood under the spray for 30 minutes, letting water they hadn't earned and didn't deserve wash away more than dirt. Others, like Machiko, turned the water off after 2 minutes, unable to accept comfort that felt like betrayal. Hana stood at the entrance to the shower room, notebook in hand, measuring water pressure and temperature and flow rate with the same scientific precision she brought to everything. She wrote down numbers that told a story more devastating than any propaganda film. Water pressure 40 pounds per square inch. Temperature 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Flow rate 2.5 gallons per minute. Infrastructure capable of delivering unlimited hot water to 200 prisoners required industrial-level plumbing, fuel abundance, and maintenance systems that Japan had never possessed even in peacetime. "This is not theater," she said to no one in particular. "This is real. This is their normal. And if this is how they treat prisoners, what do they do for their own people?" That night in the barracks, the women lay in beds with clean sheets and tried to process what they had experienced. Outside, the lights of the camp cast long shadows through the windows. Guards walked their rounds, not with the cruel efficiency of jailers, but with the bored casualness of men doing a job that required minimal effort. Keiko held the blood-stained notebook that contained Ayumi's unread letter. She had been carrying it for almost a month, unable to open it, unable to throw it away. Opening it meant confirming whether her sister was alive or dead. Keeping it closed meant living in the uncertainty that was somehow easier to bear than knowledge. In the darkness, Machiko's voice came soft and broken. "My brother Takeshi died eating sweet potato skins. It was all we had left. He gave me his rice ration the day before, said I needed strength to operate the radio. I refused. He insisted. He died 2 days later, and I have been carrying that rice grain ever since." She held up a small locket, opened it to show the single dried grain inside. "And here they throw away bread, they waste water. They discard food that would have kept him alive. How do I honor his sacrifice when the enemy he died fighting had so much abundance they didn't even notice it?" No one had an answer, because there was no answer. Only the truth sitting heavy in the darkness like a stone in the stomach. They had been lied to about American weakness, about Japanese strength, about the war's purpose and the possibility of victory, about everything that had given meaning to their suffering and nobility to their sacrifices. And if the lies ran that deep, what else had been hidden? What other truths had been carefully obscured to maintain the fiction that Japan's cause was just and its victory inevitable? The questions would multiply in the weeks to come, each answer revealing new depths of deception until the edifice of belief they had been raised on collapsed entirely. But that night, exhausted and confused and mourning certainties they could never reclaim, the women at Camp McCoy fell asleep to the sound of guards laughing somewhere in the distance and the smell of pine drifting through open windows and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more revelations they weren't ready to face. The war was over. The fighting had stopped. But for Keiko, Machiko, and Hana, the real battle was just beginning. The battle against everything they had been taught to believe. The battle for truth in a world built on lies. And they would discover in the months to come that winning that battle would be more painful than any defeat on any battlefield could ever be. The first meal in the Camp McCoy mess hall was served at 6:30 in the morning, announced by a bell that echoed across the compound with a clarity that seemed almost aggressive. Keiko woke to that sound on her first full day as a prisoner and lay still for a moment trying to remember where she was. The bed was too soft. The air smelled wrong pine and wood smoke instead of salt and ash. Through the window, she could see trees turning gold in the early September light. And for just a second, she forgot about Nagasaki, forgot about the bomb, forgot about everything except the simple fact that autumn was coming and the world was still turning. Then memory crashed back, and with it came the weight of everything she was trying not to think about. Ayumi's letter still unopened in her notebook. The children who had died in her arms. The lies that had brought her to this place where hot water ran freely and bread was thrown away and nothing made sense anymore. The mess hall was already half full when she arrived. Women sat at long tables speaking in whispers or not speaking at all, their eyes fixed on plates that seemed designed to mock everything they had endured. Oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins, scrambled eggs that had been cooked with real butter, toast with jam, fresh fruit that must have cost more than a week's rations back home, coffee that smelled like actual coffee instead of burned acorns, and disappointment. Keiko took her tray and sat beside Hana, who was measuring the portions with a small ruler she had somehow acquired, writing in that eternal notebook, documenting the evidence of a reality that shouldn't exist. 2 cups of oatmeal, Hannah said quietly, not looking up. Approximately 400 calories. 3 eggs, another 240. 2 slices of toast with butter and jam, 320. Fruit maybe 80. Coffee with cream and sugar, 60. Total caloric intake for one breakfast, approximately 1,100 calories. She put down her pencil and looked at Keiko with eyes that had stopped sleeping properly. That is more than the daily ration for a Japanese soldier in the final year of the war. They are feeding us prisoners more in one meal than our military received in an entire day. How does that make any sense? It didn't. But then nothing made sense anymore. Michiko arrived late, her hair still damp from a shower she had finally allowed herself to take. She sat down without taking food, just staring at the other women eating. I cannot, she said when Keiko pushed a plate toward her. Takeshi is not eating. How can I Panaimo? Takeshi is dead, Keiko said more harshly than she intended. Starving yourself will not bring him back. It will only mean he died for nothing, and you followed him into the grave for no reason. Michiko flinched like she'd been struck, but she picked up the fork. The work assignments came after breakfast. Keiko was assigned to the infirmary, presumably because someone had read her file and seen that she had medical training. Michiko was sent to the kitchen. Hana, because of her careful documentation and obvious intelligence, was given the task of inventorying medical supplies, a job that seemed designed to keep her busy rather than accomplish anything useful. The infirmary was a small building at the east end of the camp, clean and well-stocked, in a way that made Keiko's chest tighten with something between envy and rage. Shelves lined with bottles of antiseptic, boxes of gauze, packets of sulfanilamide powder that could stop infections before they started. Instruments that gleamed under electric lights, sterilized and ready for use. A proper operating table with adjustable height and good overhead lighting. Everything she had needed in Nagasaki and never had. Margaret Collins was already there when Keiko arrived, organizing supplies with the kind of brisk efficiency that suggested she had been a nurse long before the war, turned everyone into something harder than they used to be. She was 28 tall for a woman with auburn hair, pulled back in a tight bun, and green eyes that missed nothing. You must be Keiko, she said through an interpreter, extending a hand. I'm Margaret, Red Cross. I'll be supervising the infirmary. Your file says you have medical training. Keiko nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Good, we don't get many serious cases here, mostly minor injuries and the occasional illness. But it's important work. Keeping people healthy matters even in a place like this. She turned back to the supplies, opened a fresh package of gauze, used half to demonstrate proper wound dressing technique, and then threw the remainder in the trash. Keiko watched the white cloth arc through the air and land in the bin. Perfectly good gauze. Clean, sterile, usable. Thrown away because it had been open for 24 hours and therefore carried a contamination risk too small to measure, but too large to accept. In Nagasaki, she had reused gauze until it rotted, had boiled it in contaminated water, and hoped the heat would kill whatever was growing in the fabric. Had watched patients develop infections because there was nothing clean to dress their wounds with, And rationing meant choosing who got the limited supplies and who got apologies. Her hands started shaking. She clenched them into fists, trying to stop the tremor before Margaret noticed. "Something wrong?" Margaret asked, her voice softer now, concerned. Keiko wanted to scream, wanted to grab that trash bin and shake it, and demand to know how anyone could waste resources like this while people were dying for lack of basic supplies. But she didn't speak enough English to explain, and even if she did, what would be the point? Margaret wasn't cruel. She was just operating in a world where abundance was normal and waste was acceptable because there was always more. "Why you throw away?" Keiko managed in halting English. "Still good." Margaret looked genuinely confused. "It's been open 24 hours. Contamination risk, hospital protocol. We have plenty more." Plenty. That word again. The word that existed in English but had no real equivalent in the Japanese Keiko had spoken for the last 3 years of war. "In Nagasaki," Keiko said slowly, fighting for each word, "we have no plenty. We have only not enough. Always not enough." Understanding dawned in Margaret's eyes, followed by something that might have been pity or might have been guilt. She didn't apologize. What would be the point? She hadn't made the war. She hadn't decided which nation would have plenty and which would have perpetual scarcity. She just nodded and went back to work, and Keiko spent the rest of the morning learning American medical protocols in a language she barely spoke, surrounded by supplies that represented more wealth than her entire hospital had possessed at the height of its capacity. Michiko's assignment to the kitchen revealed abundance of a different kind. The storage room smelled of flour and coffee and canned goods stacked in rows that seemed to stretch forever. There were boxes of powdered milk and tins of meat and sacks of rice that put Japan's careful rationing to shame. The head cook, a stout woman named Dorothy who spoke no Japanese and communicated entirely through gestures and occasional frustrated English, showed Michiko how to prepare vegetables for the evening meal. The waste was immediate and shocking. Outer leaves of lettuce discarded, potato peels thrown away instead of boiled for soup, carrots with small blemishes tossed in the scrap bin because they weren't perfect enough for American prisoners to eat. Michiko stood at the cutting board, watching Dorothy trim a roast and discard pieces of fat that represented more calories than her family had seen in a week. She thought about Takeshi, always so hungry in those final months, gnawing on sweet potato skins, because the actual sweet potato had to be saved for their mother. She thought about the day he had given her his rice ration, insisting she needed strength for her work, and how she had refused until he made it an order, pulling rank as the elder brother, even though they were both starving. 2 days later, he was dead, his body so light when they carried him to the burial ground that it felt like he was already mostly gone. And here in an enemy prison camp, there was enough food to feed everyone with surplus left over for the trash. That night, she thought about the sandwich she had retrieved from the garbage at the train station weeks ago. The one she had hidden under her bunk, unable to eat it, unable to throw it away. She pulled it out now, the bread molded and inedible, and stared at it in the darkness. This was what she had become. A woman who kept rotting food as proof of something she couldn't name. Evidence of waste. Evidence of lies. Evidence that Takeshi had died for nothing while the enemy had everything. She threw it away finally. Not because she had accepted anything, but because keeping it felt like keeping Takeshi's death fresh and unhealed. Hana's inventory work gave her access to numbers that confirmed what she had been calculating since the ship. The medical supplies alone represented wealth that staggered belief. Penicillin in quantities that could treat thousands. Morphine for pain management. Surgical instruments in duplicate and triplicate. Bandages and gauze and antiseptic in amounts that suggested American medical infrastructure operated on principles of abundant caution rather than desperate triage. She documented everything in her notebook, creating comparison charts that told a story more devastating than any propaganda film. Average bone density of American women significantly higher than Japanese soldiers. Average daily caloric intake at the camp 2,800 calories, double what Japanese military rations had provided even before the food situation became critical. Infrastructure investment, hot water systems, electric lighting, mechanical refrigeration, all standard rather than luxury. The numbers painted a picture of two nations separated not by culture or philosophy, but by fundamental resource availability. America hadn't won the war through superior spirit or greater sacrifice. They had won because they had more of everything, More food, more steel, more oil, more industrial capacity, more population, more infrastructure, more of the basic material necessities that turned ideology into action. And if that was true, if the war had been decided by arithmetic rather than valor, then what had all the sacrifices meant? What had Takeshi's death accomplished? What had the children of Nagasaki died for? October arrived with cold nights and brilliant autumn colors that seemed obscene in their beauty. The trees around Camp McCoy turned gold and red and orange, transforming the landscape into something that belonged in a painting rather than a prison camp. The women were allowed outside during the day, as long as they stayed within the fence line, and some of them spent hours just staring at the leaves, trying to remember when beauty had last felt possible. The letters home were approved in mid-October, strictly censored but allowed. The women sat in the barracks with paper and pencils trying to find words for experiences that had no vocabulary. Keiko wrote to her sister, addressing the letter to their family home in Nagasaki, even though she had no idea if the house still existed or if Ayumi was alive to read it. Dear Ayumi, if you live, I am in a place where hot water never ends, where bread is given freely, not measured, where the guards smile instead of strike. I cannot explain it, only that it is different than anything I knew. Are you warm? Are you eating? I think of you every day. Your sister Keiko. She folded the letter and gave it to the censor, knowing it might never reach its destination, knowing that even if it did, Ayumi might not understand what she was trying to say. How do you explain abundance to someone who has only known scarcity? How do you describe a world where waste is normal to someone who has learned to value every grain of rice? Machiko couldn't write at all. She sat with blank paper for an hour, pencil in hand, and finally put it aside without a single word. What could she tell her family? That she was eating well while Takeshi rotted in the ground, that the enemy had treated her with more dignity than her own officers had, that everything they had been told about American cruelty was a lie. There were no words for that kind of betrayal. Hana wrote to her father, careful and formal, asking questions she already knew the answers to. Honorable Father, I am well and being treated according to international law. The conditions here are adequate. I have been observing American industrial capacity and would like to know if the production figures I have encountered are accurate. Did you ever see intelligence reports suggesting American aircraft production exceeded 90,000 units per year? If so, why were we told we could achieve victory? Your devoted daughter, Hannah. She sealed the letter knowing her father would probably not respond, knowing that if he did, it would be lies or silence because the truth was too dangerous to write and too devastating to speak. The division among the prisoners deepened as autumn progressed. There were women who clung to denial with desperate faith, insisting that the abundance was theater, that American strength was illusion, that Japan's surrender had been premature rather than inevitable. They formed a faction around a woman named Reiko Yamada, who had arrived with a second transport in late September. Reiko was 32, a former teacher with a son who had died at Iwo Jima. She had a photograph of him in his uniform, 19 years old and trying to look brave for the camera, and she carried it everywhere like a talisman against doubt. Her son had died a hero, she insisted, had given his life fighting weak American cowards who won through numbers rather than courage. Accepting that America was strong meant accepting that Hiroshi's death was meaningless, and that was a truth she would never allow. She organized the deniers with the same efficiency she had once used to organize classrooms. They refused extra rations, fasted on principle, maintained strict discipline, and shunned anyone who expressed doubt about Japan's moral superiority. When Machiko was caught eating a full breakfast one morning, Reiko publicly shamed her in front of the entire barracks. You dishonor your brother by accepting enemy comfort. Reiko said, her voice cold with righteous anger. Every bite you take is a betrayal of his sacrifice. Machiko stood there trembling, unable to defend herself because part of her believed Reiko was right. It was Keiko who stepped forward, surprising herself with the anger in her voice. Her brother starved to death eating sweet potato skins, while these people throw away fresh bread. Who dishonored him? Machiko, who survived, or the leaders who told us America was starving while they wasted food? The barracks went silent. Even Reiko seemed taken aback by the directness of the accusation. You have been corrupted, Reiko said finally, but her voice carried less certainty than before. By enemy propaganda, by comfortable lies. You forget who we are. No, Keiko said quietly. I am remembering who we were told to be, and discovering it was a lie. The barracks divided after that, believers and doubters, sorted by which truth they could bear to accept. The dividing line ran through friendships and shared experiences, separating women who had survived the same war into factions that could barely speak to each other. Late one night when the believers were asleep and the camp was quiet, except for the footsteps of guards on their rounds, Keiko Michiko and Hana met in the corner of the barracks farthest from Reiko's faction. I have been calculating production numbers, Hana whispered, opening her notebook to pages dense with figures. Based on conversations I have overheard, equipment I have seen, infrastructure capacity I have observed, the numbers are impossible to deny. She showed them the calculations: steel production estimates, oil consumption rates, agricultural output comparisons, industrial capacity ratios. Japan could not win this war, she said, her voice flat with the kind of despair that comes from mathematical certainty. Not from 1941, not from 1937 when the China conflict began, possibly not from 1901 when we occupied Manchuria. The resource disparity was too large. The industrial gap was too wide. Every year we fought, we fell further behind. Every battle we won cost us more than we could afford. Every sacrifice brought us closer to the inevitable conclusion. Then why did they send us to fight? Michiko asked, her voice breaking. Hana didn't answer immediately. She flipped to the back of her notebook, to a page she had kept hidden until now. A letter she had received from her father before the war when she was still in school, and he was still teaching her about duty and honor and the nobility of service. My father knew these numbers, she said quietly. He had access to intelligence reports. He understood industrial capacity. He taught me how to read production data. And still he supported the war. Still he sent young men to die. Still he told me that Japanese spirit would overcome American materialism. She closed the notebook and looked at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. I have been carrying his letter since before I was captured, the one he sent just before I was deployed. I have not opened it because I am afraid of what it will say. Because if he admits he knew, if he confesses the truth, then I will have to accept that my own father sent children to die for a cause he knew was lost. Keiko reached out and took Hana's hand, squeezed it gently. Then do not open it yet, she said. Wait until you are strong enough to bear whatever truth it contains. But they all knew that strength would never come. Some truths were too heavy to bear at any weight. November brought the first snow, and with it a new revelation. The camp was heated, not with small stoves carefully rationed for fuel, but with a central heating system that kept the barracks warm enough that women didn't need to sleep in their coats. The furnaces burned constantly, fed with wood that seemed inexhaustible, as if America's forests were as infinite as its industrial capacity. Keiko lay in her warm bed and remembered the winter of 1944 in Nagasaki, when fuel had been so scarce that patients froze to death in their hospital beds because there was nothing to burn for heat. She remembered amputating frostbitten toes and fingers, watching gangrene spread because cold had killed tissue that antibiotics might have saved. And here prisoners were kept warm as a matter of course, not as a luxury or a reward, but as a baseline standard of humane treatment. The re-education lectures began in mid-November. American officers came to explain why the war had ended, presenting their version of events with calm authority and statistical evidence. Most of the women refused to attend, at first seeing it as propaganda designed to break their spirit. But curiosity eventually won out. On November 12th, nearly 200 women gathered in the mess hall to hear an American colonel explain the mathematics of defeat. He spoke through an interpreter, his voice matter-of-fact, presenting numbers that should have been classified, but were apparently so overwhelming that secrecy no longer mattered. In 1944, he said the United States produced 96,318 aircraft. In that same year, Japan produced 28,180. A gasp rippled through the audience. Some women covered their mouths as if the numbers themselves were obscene. Hana's hand trembled as she wrote the figures down. She calculated in the margins, her mathematical training demanding verification, even though she already knew the numbers were true. Japan's best year had produced less than one-third of America's output. Not close, not competitive, not even in the same category of industrial capacity. The colonel continued with more statistics: tank production, ship construction, steel output, oil reserves. Every number told the same story. Japan had been fighting a war It could never win, burning through resources it didn't have, sacrificing lives for a cause that mathematics had already decided. When the lecture ended, the women filed out in stunned silence. Even Reiko, who had attended with the intention of mocking American lies, looked shaken. She clutched her son's photograph, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been the beginning of acceptance. That night, the barracks erupted in arguments that had been building since September. Believers insisted the numbers were fabricated. Doubters demanded to know why, if the figures were lies, the evidence of abundance was so overwhelming. Women who had been friends for months stopped speaking. Women who had survived bombings and battles together fractured over the question of which version of reality to accept. In the chaos, Sachiko Endo, a quiet woman who had worked as a clerk in a supply depot, stood up and screamed, "They betrayed us." The barracks fell silent. "They knew," Sachiko said, her voice shaking. "The officers, the ministers, the generals. They saw these numbers. They knew American production capacity. They knew we could not win, and they sent us to fight anyway. They sent our brothers and sons and husbands to die for pride, for honor, for nothing." She collapsed onto her bunk sobbing, and no one moved to comfort her because they were all thinking the same thing. The betrayal wasn't that Japan had lost. The betrayal was that Japan's leaders had known defeat was inevitable and had demanded sacrifice anyway. Keiko sat in the darkness that night holding Ayumi's unopened letter, thinking about all the patients who had died in her arms, while she whispered reassurances about victory that was coming, about sacrifices that would matter, about a better world their suffering would build. She had believed those lies, had passed them on to dying children, had been complicit in a system that valued obedience over truth and demanded silence over accountability. And now she was in a place where hot water ran freely and bread was wasted, and the enemy showed more mercy than her own leaders ever had. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow will be strong enough to open that letter. But tomorrow never came because some truths remain too heavy no matter how long you wait. December arrived with snow that transformed Camp McCoy into something from a picture book, all white fields and frosted pine trees that caught the morning light like they were trying to prove that beauty could exist anywhere, even in a prison camp, surrounded by the wreckage of shattered certainties. The women woke to frost patterns on the windows and the smell of wood smoke from furnaces that burned without ceasing, keeping the barracks warm in a way that felt like mockery wrapped in kindness. The guards began decorating for Christmas in early December, stringing lights along the mess hall and setting up a tree in the common area. Most of the women had never seen a Christmas celebration before. To them, it was just another strange American custom in a land full of incomprehensible abundance. But Keiko, who had studied some Western traditions in school, recognized the symbolism. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men, ideas that seemed almost obscene given where they were and why. Margaret found Keiko in the infirmary 3 days before Christmas, organizing supplies with the kind of methodical precision that comes from trying not to think too hard about anything. They had developed a working relationship over the past 3 months, communicating through broken English and hand gestures in the universal language of medical care. Margaret had stopped throwing away half-used supplies in front of Keiko, instead quietly disposing of them when she wasn't looking. It was a small kindness, pointless in its way, but Keiko appreciated the thought. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said, waiting for the interpreter who came by twice a day. "About your family. Do you know if they're safe?" Keiko's hand tightened on the bottle of antiseptic she was shelving. She shook her head. "I have a letter," she said slowly in English, that had improved over the months. "From my sister, from before I was captured. I have not opened it." Margaret's expression shifted to something between confusion and concern. "Why not?" "Because if she is dead, the letter is her grave, and I am not ready to visit graves." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by medical supplies that represented more wealth than Keiko's entire hospital had possessed, while the question of whether her sister had survived hung in the air like smoke. "My brother died at Okinawa," Margaret said finally. "Danny, he was 20. I got his last letter the day after the telegram came telling me he was gone. It took me 3 weeks to open it." Keiko looked up, meeting her eyes. "He wrote about how scared he was," Margaret continued. "How he didn't want to die, how he kept thinking about home and Mom's cooking and the baseball games we used to go to. He wrote that he was fighting people who were probably just as scared as he was, People who probably had sisters waiting for letters they'd never get to read. Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. I hated your country for a long time after that. Hated everyone who had anything to do with the war. But you know what I realized? Hating you won't bring Danny back. And you didn't kill him any more than I killed your patients in Nagasaki. We're just people who got caught in something bigger than ourselves. Something that men in power decided for us. Keiko felt tears burning in her eyes but refused to let them fall. In Japan, we are taught not to question, she said, to obey, to sacrifice, to believe what we are told. I believed. And people died because I believed lies instead of demanding truth. That doesn't make you evil, Margaret said gently. It makes you human. We all want to believe the best about our countries, our leaders. The alternative is too painful. She reached out and squeezed Keiko's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable when they first met. When you're ready to open that letter, I'll be here. Whatever it says, you won't have to face it alone. Christmas morning came and the women assembled in the mess hall. This was the moment that had opened their story months ago, the breakfast that would break them completely. The plates arrived, 6 strips of bacon, 3 eggs, toast, orange juice, coffee. The smell alone was overwhelming, rich with fat and butter in abundance that seemed designed to mock every sacrifice they had ever made. The women stood frozen, 200 pairs of eyes staring at food that represented more than they had seen in months. The silence was profound. It was Machiko who shattered first. She picked up the chocolate bar that had been placed beside each plate. A simple Hershey's bar, the kind American soldiers had carried throughout the war. Her mind flashed back to her 8th birthday, 1933, when her father had brought home a single piece of chocolate. She had shared it with Takeshi, and they had made it last an hour, savoring sweetness they knew might not come again for years. Flash forward to 1940, Takeshi giving her his rice portion. Refusing to eat, dying 2 days later, his body wasted by starvation. And here, American guards were handing out chocolate bars like they were nothing. Machiko's scream tore through the mess hall like a wound opening. He died for a grain of rice. Every conversation stopped. Every guard turned. 200 women froze in place. My brother starved to death eating sweet potato skins, and you hand this out like trash. She threw the chocolate bar across the room with enough force to make it shatter against the far wall. Then she collapsed her legs, giving out her body, folding in on itself as months of carefully controlled grief erupted in sobs that sounded like they were tearing her apart from the inside. They lied to him, she wailed, her voice raw and broken. They told him Americans were weak and starving. They told him his sacrifice would matter, that if he just held on, victory would come, and he believed them. He died believing those lies while the people he was fighting had so much they could throw it away. Keiko dropped to her knees beside Machiko, wrapping her arms around her, while she shook with grief that had been dammed up too long. Other women began crying too, their own stories of loss and deprivation surfacing in the presence of abundance that made every sacrifice seem meaningless. It was Reiko who finally moved. Reiko, who had been the loudest voice of denial, who had organized the believers and shamed the doubters. She walked slowly to where Machiko was sobbing in Keiko's arms. She knelt down, moving like her joints hurt, like she had aged decades in the space of a single breakfast. In her hand, she held the photograph of her son Hiroshi. My son died at Iwo Jima, Reiko said quietly. Her voice had lost its harsh certainty. They told me he died a hero fighting weak American cowards. I believed them. I needed to believe them because the alternative was unbearable. She looked around the mess hall at the abundance that could no longer be denied. But I watched the baseball game last month. I saw American men, common men, moving with strength our best soldiers never possessed. I saw them laugh like the war was a bad dream they had already forgotten. And I knew. I have known for weeks, but refused to accept it. She held up the photograph, her hand trembling. Hiroshi did not die fighting cowards. He died fighting men who were stronger, better fed, better equipped. He died because our leaders sent him to fight a war they knew we could not win. That is not heroism. That is murder dressed in the language of sacrifice. The mess hall was absolutely silent. I called you traitors, Reiko said, looking directly at Keiko, for accepting American kindness, for questioning Japanese superiority. But the real traitors were in Tokyo. They knew. They saw these numbers, this abundance. and they sent our sons to die anyway. She stood slowly still, holding Hiroshi's photograph. I will return to Japan not as a prisoner freed, but as a witness. I will tell them what I saw here, that we were lied to, that our sacrifices were wasted by leaders who valued their pride over our lives. She looked around the room. I was wrong, and I am sorry. The apology hung in the air for a long moment. Then one by one, women began to stand in solidarity with a truth too painful to keep carrying alone. Keiko picked up the chocolate bar from her plate and held it out to Michiko. Takeshi died because of lies, she said gently. Refusing this won't honor him, but telling the truth might. Eat, live, remember. And when we return home, tell everyone what we learned here. Michiko took the chocolate with shaking hands. She opened it, slowly broke off a single piece, and put it in her mouth. Tears ran down her face as she chewed. For you, little brother, she whispered. I will tell the truth. I promise. January came with bitter cold that the heating system fought to a comfortable draw. On January 15th, the camp organized a baseball exhibition game. The prisoners gathered at the fence line to watch. The speed was what struck Keiko first. The crack of the bat, the sprint around bases. Players moving with explosive power that looked effortless, but required strength and conditioning and years of adequate nutrition. These were not soldiers, just ordinary American men playing a game their bodies capable of feats that would have been remarkable in Japan's best-trained military units. Hana gripped the fence with both hands, the frozen metal burning her palms. She watched a player hit a home run, the ball disappearing into the snow-covered field. These are their common men, she said quietly, and they move like athletes compared to our soldiers. The letter in her pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric. Her father's last letter still unopened after 5 months. That night, alone in the barracks while the others slept, Hana finally broke the seal. The letter was dated August 5th, 1945, written in her father's careful handwriting. My daughter, if you read this, the war is over and we have lost. I knew we would lose. In 1943, I saw intelligence reports showing American industrial capacity, aircraft production exceeding 90,000 units per year, steel output that matched our entire empire's production. I knew we could not win, not in 1943, possibly not from Pearl Harbor. But the emperor's will was absolute. Officers who spoke against the war were executed. I watched good men die for telling truth. I watched intelligence reports be rewritten. I watched our leaders choose pride over reality. I sent men to die knowing we could not win. Young men your age, Hana. I am complicit in their deaths. I value you. I valued my position, my life over their right to truth. I am a coward who chose silence when courage demanded I speak. If I am dead when you read this, know that I died ashamed. If I live, I do not deserve your forgiveness. Learn from my cowardice, Hana. Speak truth even when silence is safer. Question authority even when obedience is demanded. The price of comfortable lies is paid in other people's blood. Your father, who does not deserve the title. Hana read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking harder with each pass. Then she carefully tore it into pieces, spreading the fragments across her bunk. She stared at them for a long moment before gathering them back together and methodically taping them into coherence. She couldn't destroy it. It was evidence, testimony, proof that the system had known and had demanded sacrifice anyway. Her notebook lay beside her. She opened to a blank page and wrote a single sentence in characters that pressed so hard they nearly tore through the paper. I was not defeated by America. I was defeated by the lies of my own father and the system that rewarded his cowardice. She sat in the darkness, crying without sound, mourning not for what she had lost, but for what she had never actually possessed. In March, the letter Keiko had been waiting for finally arrived. Red Cross delivery, postmarked from Nagasaki, the envelope stained with what might have been water damage or might have been tears. Keiko held it in the infirmary, her hands shaking so badly that Margaret took it from her gently and set it on the desk between them. Do you want me to leave? Margaret asked. Keiko shook her head. Stay, please. She opened the envelope with careful precision. Oni-san, I survived. The words blurred as tears filled Keiko's eyes, but she forced herself to keep reading. I was outside the city when the flash came. Mother did not survive. She was at the cathedral. It vaporized. The city is ash. I am a volunteer nurse at a refugee clinic. We have no medicine, no bandages, no food. I boil water from contaminated wells. Yesterday, a child died in my arms because I had no gauze to stop bleeding from a simple cut. She was 6 years old. Her name was Yuki. I held pressure on the wound with my bare hands. She asked me if it would hurt. I lied and said no. Then she died. The Americans here feed us more than our government did during the war. I do not understand anything anymore. Please come home. I need you. Your sister Ayumi. Keiko sat, frozen. Yuki, 6 years old, dead from a cut that should have been nothing. She looked around at the shelves. Boxes of gauze stacked 3 deep. Bottles of antiseptic. Bandages in quantities that could have saved hundreds. One roll of gauze could have saved Yuki, and Keiko was surrounded by thousands of them while her sister held pressure on a dying child's wound with her bare hands. Margaret was crying too. I can send supplies, she said quietly. Medical equipment. Everything your sister needs. The Red Cross has channels. Why would you help us? Keiko asked. Because Yuki's death wasn't your fault, Margaret said. It was the fault of men who chose war over peace. Those men exist in every country. She paused. And because my brother Danny died fighting people who were probably just as scared as he was, I can't bring him back, but maybe I can save some of the people he died fighting against. After repatriation, Margaret continued, if you want to return to America, I can sponsor you. You could study nursing at Columbia, learn modern techniques, then help your sister from here sending supplies and knowledge. You could do more for Japan from America than from Japan. The offer hung in the air. How can I abandon my country when it needs me? Keiko asked. How can you help if you don't have resources? Margaret countered. Your sister needs medical knowledge and supplies. America has both. Japan has neither. Keiko folded the letter carefully. She would decide later. After she had seen Nagasaki with her own eyes. That night, Keiko, Machiko, and Hana met in their usual corner. When we return, Keiko said, they will call us corrupted. Let them, Machiko said. I will tell the truth about what we saw here. My father chose silence, Hana added. I choose testimony, whatever the cost. Then we are agreed, Keiko said. We return as witnesses. We will educate the next generation. We will teach them to question authority, to demand evidence, to value truth. They made a pact that night. 3 women who had lost everything except the will to testify. August 1946. The repatriation ships began loading at San Francisco. Margaret stood on the dock with Keiko, both crying. Write to me, Margaret said, pressing a paper with her Boston address into Keiko's hand. Tell me what you need. You gave me more than medicine, Keiko said. You gave me permission to question, to demand truth. I will carry that forever. They embraced prisoner and guard enemy and friend. The ship departed at dawn. The women stood on deck watching the American coastline recede. But they were carrying something America couldn't keep. They were carrying truth. Keiko stepped off the boat into Nagasaki ruins. The cathedral was a skeleton against the sky. She found Ayumi at a tent clinic. They embraced weeping. Keiko opened her suitcase. Margaret's medical textbooks, packets of gauze, bottles of antiseptic. An American nurse sent these, Keiko said. Her brother died at Okinawa. She said hate doesn't heal wounds. Only medicine does. Together, they began a nursing school teaching modern techniques from American textbooks. Michiko returned to Okinawa. Her family home was gone, replaced by an American base. Her aunt refused to see her, calling her the sister who lived while Takeshi died with honor. She found work with American Occupation Education teaching English to children. On her first day, a student asked why she worked for the enemy. Because, Michiko said, holding up the locket with Takeshi's rice grain, my brother died believing lies. I will not let you die the same way. The children called her collaborator. She wore the label like armor. Better a living traitor to lies than a dead martyr to propaganda. Hana found her father in Kyoto living in a small apartment, dishonored but alive. He had resigned his commission, lost his pension. She showed him his confession letter now published. He read it with shaking hands, tears streaming. I am ashamed, he whispered. I know, Hannah said, but shame without action is just cowardice. Come to my lectures. Sit in the back. Listen to me teach the truth you were too afraid to speak. That is your penance. He came to every lecture after that, an old general in the back row weeping silently while his daughter dismantled the lies he had helped build. Students never knew who he was. Hannah never told them. But he knew, and that was enough. Keiko 49 testified about wartime propaganda. American camps treated us with dignity, our leaders denied us. We were fed better as prisoners than as citizens. That is not American superiority. That is Japanese leadership failure. Michiko 70 spoke at the memorial. My brother died believing American soldiers were weak demons. I survived to learn they were men. The demons were the lies. We honor the dead by teaching truth. Keiko, 85. Michiko, 85. Hana, 84. Only survivors from their barracks. Margaret, 93, flew from Boston. 4 old women embraced. Their families gathered. Keiko's granddaughter, Yuki, named for the child Ayumi couldn't save, now a doctor at Johns Hopkins. Michiko's adopted daughter, a civil rights lawyer. Hana's son, a peace studies professor. They planted a cherry tree together. The plaque read, "In memory of 300 Japanese women who came as enemies, lived as prisoners, and left as witnesses to the power of truth over propaganda." Keiko spoke to the crowd. We came to America expecting cruelty. We found abundance. We expected hatred. We found humanity. We expected to confirm our beliefs. We found our beliefs were lies. Defeat in war was painful, but defeat of illusion was liberation. We returned to Japan not as broken prisoners, but as witnesses who chose truth over comfort. That choice cost us acceptance, sometimes family. But it bought us something more precious, the ability to look our grandchildren in the eyes and say we did not pass on the lies. My sister Ayumi saved thousands with medicine Margaret sent. Michiko taught democracy to children who built modern Japan. Hana's testimony helped convict leaders who lied. We were 3 women who lost a war but found the truth. And in the end, truth was the only victory that mattered. To the generation watching you who remember when America stood for these values, know that your father's kindness to former enemies changed the world. That is your legacy. Guard it well. The cherry blossoms would bloom every spring after that, pink petals falling on ground where propaganda had died and honesty had taken root. Some things once shattered can never be rebuilt the same way. But sometimes, if you're brave enough to face the truth in the broken pieces, you can build something better from the wreckage. That was the real lesson of Camp McCoy. Not that America was superior or Japan was inferior, but that truth, however painful, was always preferable to comfortable lies. And that courage meant looking directly at the shattered mirror, seeing yourself clearly in all the broken pieces, and choosing honesty over the beautiful fiction that had led so many to die for nothing.